Hello and welcome to another track analysis video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the track 9 to 5 by Chris Lake, Sammy Virji and Roro. This came out on the 22nd of August and it took quite a while to finish this, but there's loads of interesting stuff to talk about in this track. Of course, as always, there'll be a free sample pack in the description below, as well as an extended version of this tutorial on our Patreon, where we give you more in-depth analysis, mixing tutorials, synthesis techniques. We basically just talk a little bit more detail about the song, and you also get some extra presets as well as a structure project for Ableton Live 12. And if this is the first time you've seen one of our videos, go check out some of the track analysis videos after this. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So as always, let's just start off with some of the basic features. So we're at 132 beats per minute. It's pretty classic for this new kind of house garagey territory now. It's 130 plus. And in terms of the structure, we've got a pretty standard structure. These big 16 bar sections are the main areas that we're working with, but you could break these down into smaller 8 bar sections where we have big changes halfway through this drop, and then on the build up as well too. But as you can see, sprinkled in are these other short 8 bar sections, and overall it means the track is quite relatively short at around 3 minutes, 2 minutes 50 or something like that. But I do think there's an extended version online as well. And like with a lot of the other breakdowns, I really just focused on the first drop, the build up, and the section after the drop, because the second drop is pretty much identical, same with the build up as well. And let's start out by talking about the key, and to do that we need to talk about the bass line. So this is our bass line. There are a few variations that happen throughout the track, but really this is the main bass line. And the key of the track seems to be in D Phrygian from what I can tell, which is one of our main modes that we get. And the Phrygian key is very similar to the minor key. It just has a flattened second note in the scale if you were comparing it to a minor scale. And that flattened second note is this one here, the E flat. And the Phrygian mode is perfect for tracks like this that want to have a bit more of a darker dance feel. And it's used a lot more in those darker house subgenres like tech house, for example. And the bass line isn't really complicated. We only really have 3 or 4 notes. And we start off on the root note here of our D, jumping up to the octave above. And then we just move up to that second note in the scale, the one that is different to our minor scale. And that difference, if we turn scale off, you'll see it's only a semitone above our original root note. And then that kind of jumps back and forth between the different octaves, and then we just have a slight change at the end here where we go from our 4th note to our 7th note and then back to the beginning again to our 1st note. And because of the limited notes, there's much more of a focus on rhythm, as you can tell, with these very short notes which are meant to emulate a real bass guitar. They sound a lot like a real bass guitar, and a lot of these shorter notes fall on the 2nd and the 4th 16th notes within our beats here, which, as we've talked about quite a bit before, is going to be affected by our groove, which we've got on here, which is 16th note, 61 swing. And you can see these shorter notes, all in those 4th and the 2nd 16th notes, they're going to sound nice and swingy. And then we've also just got these big long 8th notes, but apart from that, there's nothing much to talk about. And because really it focuses heavily on this E flat jumping up and down, it creates quite a nice tense feel, which then gets resolved by this note pairing leading us back to our root note again. And let's move on to the synth patch. It's a relatively simple one. It took me a while to kind of get sounding exactly like the original track, but the main idea is focused around this saw wave. And I've chosen one of the new Serum 2 wave tables, which is from the ARP 2600, just because some of these waveforms just have a little bit more character to them, just unlike your basic shapes. You can even see that the top half, for example, is a little bit lower in amplitude than the bottom half, and this just creates a bit more of an interesting character. As always, I've got the random set to 0, and I just had to play around with the phase until I found a nice point where we got a nice pluck at the beginning of each of our notes. And I also played around with this new, I feel like it's new actually, one of the newer updates in Serum 2, which is this odd even harmonic modifier, which is really interesting. It basically changes the level of the odd and the even harmonics within this waveform. So if I bring it to the left, it'll basically turn it into a square wave, because that pretty much consists of all odd harmonics. And if I bring it to the right, we just get the even harmonics, which normally just sound like an octave higher in general. Let's just have a little listen to what it does. I think it's been added in one of the most recent patches, but it is a really nice feature. After this, of course, we're going into a filter. This is what's creating most of that tonal change, and I've just got it on MG Low 24 with a 20% on the resonance. The cutoff is 148 Hz, so I've not got keyboard tracking turned on because it is a very low sub bass. I've got the drive turned up quite a bit to 54%. I've also got it being modulated by envelope 2 very, very slightly. It's just adding an extra bit of pluck at the beginning of each of our bass notes. And then I've also got the filter cutoff assigned to the macro 1 here, which I've renamed as growl. And this is because at the beginning of each of our bass sections, we have these 2 notes here. I thought they were actually 2 different notes at the beginning, but it seems to be the same note of D. And the growl is just creating this bend. If you want to listen to this in the actual song, you can really hear it over in the intro right at the beginning when there's no other instruments playing. In terms of envelope 1, I've got it on not instantaneous attack because of the phase change I made up here in the waveform. I've got a little bit of a drop in sustain to 3.7 dB and then a very fast attack. So it's really just, again, adding an extra bit of snap at the beginning. And I've also got in the matrix, envelope 3 is being sent to the main tuning. If I go in envelope 3, you'll see it's an incredibly short envelope, 8 millisecond decay with no sustain and no attack. And again, originally the idea was to add a little bit of extra punch at the beginning of each note. And one of the things to point out about the bass is the sidechain. And when I started making this new plugin called Compactor, which loads of people have been talking about, came out. So I was trying it out and I've got it set to 2 millisecond attack, about a millisecond on hold, and then a 3 millisecond release, just so it's not distorting. I didn't want it to actually do what a lot of people have been showing off, which is the kind of ring modulation effect. But it's a really nice fast sidechain plugin. And if you didn't know, it is free. You can just download it. I'll put a link to it in the description below. The actual drum pattern isn't anything too crazy. You can see essentially it's just kick on every beat, clap every other beat, second and fourth beats. We have our open hat here. We've got this kind of effects hat that plays over the top of another hat there, which kind of sounds like a sample that I will talk about in a minute. A few double kick drums, as we mentioned before, and then we've got these percussion slices, which again, I think are probably just part of a longer sample that's been chopped up. These mainly just play on the 2nd, 4th, 16th notes to add that extra swing. And apart from the mix, the key thing with these drums is just variation. And you'll see in the main drop here, I've labeled all the different variations. We've got 4 different drum clips. The first one just being the one we listened to then. The second one has this big cut in the middle. It even has a little double kick drum at the end there as well. And then we move into variation number 3. We just get this layered crunchy hat, as I've called it, on top of our original hat. And those 2 hats really complement each other because one's quite bright and fizzy, and there's a lot of high frequencies. And then the other hat is kind of the opposite, where it doesn't have a lot of very high frequencies. It has a lot more of that ringy metallic hi-hat sound, and they kind of fit really nicely together. Some other interesting things to point out in this section, I've got this kind of snare roll that starts in the build-up. And if you're programming a snare roll, it can be quite hard to get it sounding natural. In the first half, there's not too many notes, so it's not too bad. I've just used the same snare. And again, one of the big things is playing these 4th and these 2nd notes to really emphasize the swing. And then when we come into the second half, I've just split it between 2 different samples. And as you can hear, they're pretty much exactly the same. If we have a look at them though, this is the first snare sample and this is the second. So you can see the second one I'm using classic mode. I've got the sustain all the way down. I've got the decay quite low as well. And then in the first sample, I'm just using the fade out to make it even shorter. And the other thing that is useful to do in this situation is to change the velocity too. So 99, 70, 83, 93, 99, 70, 83, 93. I've just repeated this kind of 4-step pattern here over and over again, breaks up that robotic snare roll feel that you get. And then we also have the drum fill at the end, which I'm pretty sure just uses the slices from before. But as you can see, I've only used like my slices here for the last part of the drop. And I actually used a drum sample just as an experiment from the track Funky President by James Brown, because it does sound a lot like the original drum loop, or at least the drum pattern. That sounds like this. And speaking of the individual drum hits, this is the original sample that I use. It's just a splice drum loop that I've used before in some of the other breakdowns. And all I did was just use the slice to new MIDI track feature on this to chop it up into loads of individual sections. And then I just took my favorite samples and used them in here, as well as this bongo loop that's just an Ableton loop too, a little bit wider as well. And then coming over to the drum bus, of course, I've not actually got a glue compressor on this because when I applied it, it just sounded too much compression. So I actually just opted for a little bit of auto clip as always. Just to give us a bit of extra volume. And if you've never seen AutoClip before, it's a clipper plugin that I've made, and you can check it out in the link in the description below. Now let's move on to the hardest part of this whole breakdown, which might seem a bit crazy, but it is this analog pad. And if we look at the chords, this chord is a really interesting chord that I played around with for ages trying to get the right notes. But if I move this bottom note up an octave above, we basically got a seventh chord. So 1, 3, 5, 7, with the seventh note being inverted below. And then we also have an additional second note in here. I think this would be a -7 sus2 chord, something like that. And the other thing to point out about this is the chord is actually in D minor instead of D Phrygian, because having this additional note in our Phrygian would sound like this. And you basically get the same chord in this second, but just a lower octave down. And the key thing to talk about, of course, is the patch with this. So I ended up actually going for these two square waves, one at the original octave and one an octave above. Both have got unison turned on pretty high and the detune turned up quite a lot too. And they go into filter 1 here, which is a low high pass 12 dB. And it's a bit hard to see, but basically the cutoff here controls this top low pass filter. And if you watch it, it basically goes up, opens up to let some of our oscillators through. And of course the noise here, which I didn't mention before, which is set to ARP pink. The resonance is also turned up quite a bit too, but the other frequency down here controls a high pass filter on the bottom. So it's essentially a band pass filter, but you have control over both, how wide essentially that band pass is. And all the movement is created by envelope 2. So you see envelope 2 controls the cutoff moving up. It also controls the resonance, interestingly, going down. So as the cutoff increases, the resonance comes down. And then when the cutoff comes back down again, the resonance increases again. And if I turn this off, you'll hear why. Because at the top end of that movement, you get this really sharp, harsh frequency. When I turn this on, it's a much smoother effect in the top end. And envelope 2 is also controlling the volume of the noise as well. Envelope 3 is controlling the high pass filter down here. And this is a much shorter envelope, as you can see. And the funny thing about this is it's probably just the most simple patch you've ever seen in the original track. But the amount of variables just made it very difficult to get exactly right. The other thing that happens as well, in the second chord, I have a macro 1 here assigned to the cutoff, and this just comes down, as you can see. So you get this darker sound in this chord, and then it goes back up for the main one. And in terms of the envelopes, envelope 2 here has quite a long attack. It has no sustain and a long decay, but I've also turned up the hold a little bit, because if you look at the actual chord, it was difficult to tell whether these were actually two chords like this, or if it was one big long chord. And I ended up going for the big long chord because the sidechain makes it sound like two instead of this. But again, it could be that this is actually the right way. And another thing to point out about this chord as well is a bend at the beginning. Of course, there's a bend moving up. And the pitch bend amount in here is just the default, which is -2 and +2. But I wasn't 100% happy with how this sounded. It got pretty close, but it's just not exactly the same as the original. So it'll be really interesting to see where that original sound came from. It sounds very analog, especially in the second chord here. I did try Diva, Repro, all those other synths, but they just didn't have that same effect. Now let's move back over to the build-up now. And so let's start with this soft pad sound that comes in right at the beginning. And the most interesting part really of this is the chords that are being used. And the chords could be seen as being in D Phrygian, but they also could technically be in D minor as well. There's not a massive difference. You can see though that we have these notes that are outside of the scale. So we start off just with our chords at the beginning. This chord here is again a 7th chord. You just got to ignore this note here, but this is the 1st, 3rd, 5th, 6th, and then the 7th on the top. The second chord is also a 7th chord, and it works in the Phrygian scale, so that's why I think it's closer to the Phrygian scale. Exactly the same layout, but of course the first chord has that top note inverted. But the third chord here is the interesting one because you can see that we have notes outside of our scale, in particular the E and the B up here. And this E on the bottom here is basically just the note in between the second and the last chord. And the note up here, the B, has been shifted up. But this chord here is essentially an E minor 7th chord, which doesn't live within our D Phrygian scale, and it's essentially like a borrowed chord, and it's not too difficult to actually do. If we move these back to this chord before, essentially what we've done is copy the chord over. You could even start by trying to shift all the notes up. But instead, all they've done is move the first note up and the 5th note. But after this, we come back out to this big stack of a chord over here on the right hand side, which is very similar to our first chord at the beginning, but just with some additional notes in between. And the other interesting thing about the chord sequence is, again, there's a very slight amount of pitch bend at the end of this first chord and at the beginning of the last one. You know, these tiny little variations and articulations really just help it come alive. And then that kind of leads us into the end of this section here, where we have this big pitch bend on the last chord. And then that last chord just holds and holds into the next section. And this is a great way of building tension, and just looking at the actual chord that's being used, because of the bass note, I essentially think it's some kind of G chord in here. So we've got the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and then the 7th, again, our 7th chord, but with this additional second note in between, just with the top note inverted down. But yeah, essentially we've got this G chord, which is the 4th, 1, 2, 3, 4th chord within our D Phrygian scale. I think this is a imperfect cadence, which is more of a classical music theory technique, going from the 4th chord to the 1st chord. The actual sound of this is really just a simple sine wave. You can check out the preset in the description below. And there's a bass underneath all of these chords. It's just playing the root note. It sounds like this. And in terms of the synth patch, I've got that ARP 2600 again, basically the same as the actual bass, but I've used that odd even to tilt it a little bit towards a square wave, and then the filter is basically the same again. The one thing I wanted to talk about with this bass though is the sidechain. And this here is Vision, again, a spectrogram view of the reference track, not my remake. And the one thing that really interested me was the bass in this section, because if you look, you can see how the bass kind of hugs the kick drum here in terms of its frequency. There's a little bit of a gap at the end you can see, which is the sidechain kind of being released again when it's dipped, but the bass goes all the way right up to the front of the kick. And it really interested me because if you look at regular compression like in our remake, you get something that looks a bit more like this, where you'll see the sidechain dip when the top half of this kick drum hits our sound. So there should always be kind of a gap, as you can see on mine here, before and after. And so I thought maybe this isn't regular sidechain. So I just set up a little demonstration here. That was using Compactor, but I also set this up using Soothe, because Soothe is a dynamic EQ, but it's one of those high precision, high frequency band dynamic EQs where it will basically recreate your frequency spectrum and then cut it with an EQ in like the exact same shape. I'm sure you've probably seen Soothe before. I've got to set it with the sidechain turned on to the kick drum. I've got like the sensitivity just full all the way throughout. And I think I even used a shelf here, this band, to boost some of the frequencies a little bit more. You see there, got it set to hard, high depth as high as it can be, and very fast attack and release. And now if we have a look at this through Vision, you start to get a little bit closer to what that sidechain was inside the actual reference track. And if we just look at the bass, you'll see it kind of creates this kick drum shape in the dip that it made. Again, this could just be a weird thing that's happened, maybe even during the mastering stage. Maybe even the sidechain is just coming in a little bit too late. And I don't have it as well, but I also think this could be a plugin called Track Spacer, which you might have seen too. And I did download the demo for this and give it a little bit of a go, and it did achieve very, very similar results. So maybe that's what's being used as the sidechain in this section. Again, if you have any other ideas on how this is happening, let me know in the comments below. Now let's talk about something that I can't play, which are the vocals. And the vocals in this track seem to be original vocals by Roro. Maybe there's a different way of saying their name, but I recreated a very short section of the vocals just so we could work out the notes. And the big thing about these vocals is they really heavily focus around that D Phrygian mode, which of course is in everything else. So you can see we actually start on that note, the second note, which is the flattened second compared to a minor key. And then we jump down to the A, which is our fifth note. And we basically just move up and down between these three separate notes here. There's a big section as well over near the end of this first half of the drop too, where the vocals do this kind of descending pattern as well. It just generally focuses around this D Phrygian, but it also has that atonal aspect where it's not really following a key at the end. There is an interesting thing in the build-up though, which I wanted to show you, where the vocal does this repeating effect. I tried this in basically two different ways. The first way I tried it was using just this simpler here, taken out the word name, which is the repeated word, and all I've done is just automated the length, as you can see at the bottom there. You can see automating the sample length so it gets shorter and shorter. And it's one big long note in the background there, as you can see. But what I realized was it actually sounds a little bit different like this one below, which is just the same idea, but with a different technique. The difference though is I've used arpeggiator for this, and that's because you can get that shorter gated note sound compared to, which is playing the whole sample. And then I've just automated the rate, 455 milliseconds. In order to get that right, all I did was just selected a eighth note section like this, and in the bottom of Ableton you'll see it says the time in milliseconds there, 455. So I just put that into arpeggiator, and then all I had to do was automate that to go down to basically get the same effect. These won't be available in the preset pack just because, again, it is from the original project, but try out this technique in a track that you have, especially in a build-up like this. And with that, we come to the end of the recreation. I think the main focuses in this track, of course, will be on the drums, the bass, the vocals as well, but importantly, the drums and the bass are like the two elements that are just essential to this track. A lot of the other elements in the song are just kind of to add a little bit of variation, like the analog pad and the organ pad, but a really heavy focus on getting a nice drum groove and a bass line are what really solidify this track. I do also love that it's written in the Phrygian mode as well, which just gives it a unique edge to a lot of other tracks that you hear out there. And this is a thing I'd recommend to try as well at home, and it will just stand out from the rest of the crowd that are just using the major and minor modes. Importantly as well, there's a super clean mix and these really heavy drums too. And if you want to see how those drums are mixed in more detail, we do cover it a little bit on our Patreon extended version in the link below. And if you enjoyed this video, as always, make sure to like it because it does help support the channel, and hit that subscribe button as well. We did just hit 5,000 subscribers last week or 2 weeks ago, and I did mention that we are doing a giveaway for some free prizes which will be coming in the next 2 weeks or so. So make sure you hit subscribe if you want to be notified of that. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.